Finishing up the discussion of the insects that chew on leaves, I want to talk about two kinds of beetle groups that are also found associated with foliage, the root weevils and the Japanese beetle. Now, root weevils are a complex of beetles in the snout beetle or weevil family. They've got mouth parts attached to a little beak on the front, and the larvae develop on the roots of plants, and almost all of these are in the genus Audiorhynchus. This includes a very important insect in the nursery industry nationwide, the black vine weevil. Includes some other actors that are less commonly observed, strawberry root weevil, rough strawberry root weevil, lilac root weevil. All of these are in this genus Audiorhynchus, and all of these are present in Colorado and the western states. None of them fly. They walk, but they are easily distributed in nursery stock and have been distributed throughout much of North America. The one species that is outside that genus that is also fairly well distributed now is the decorated root weevil, Dislobus decoratus. Now, the kinds of injuries that you're going to see root weevils produce are various. You're going to see leaf notching of foliage by the adults, but you will also have root pruning by larvae. This is not commonly observed, or even the effects of it commonly observed. And several of the root weevils also attract our attention because they enter buildings. They're one of the kind of nuisance invaders that enter buildings. Now, the adult stage feeds on foliage, and it feeds on foliage in a way that is quite unique and very distinctive. It's a leaf notching, where you're going to have an angular cut along the edge that is confined along the edge, although it may extend a fair degree into the interior. And that's because weevils, including these root weevils, the adults chew along the edge. Their mouth parts are such at the end of that little beak that they really can't chew well into the interior of the leaf, so most of the activity is on the edge. Now, you're not going to see them doing this ever unless you go out at night, because all of the root weevils in the adult form are active at night. One of many insects that are out and about at night that you would miss otherwise, including earwigs, for instance, or the slugs, if we're talking about other kinds of plant pests. So the damage you're going to see, again, is some kind of angular cut along the leaf edge. And some plants will be favored over others, but sometimes several different kinds of plants may show some evidence of this activity, because these are often fairly generalist feeders. Probably the most common one now, or at least the most damaging one now, is one known as the lilac root weevil. And it is probably most conspicuous on lilac, but has a lot of common hosts. Privet and peony would be two that you also see the little notches of this, but it also feeds on some other plants as well, as do all the other root weevils. Now, the root weevil larva is going to be found in the soil, in the roots, as the name suggests. It is a typical weevil larva, and we're going to see lots of weevil larvae. Weevils, bark beetles, these are all in the weevil family. A weevil larva is a pretty stripped down insect. It has no legs. It does have a head, and it does have chewing mouth parts. So these things will chew, and the head, it will be quite conspicuous because it needs to be hard and capable of supporting the muscles that allow them to chew, but no legs. Now, there will be other kinds of insects that we'll see in soil, most notably coming up with Japanese beetle, a larval stage known as a white grub. And one of the big differences between a weevil larva of some kind and a grub, a white grub, is whether they have legs or not. Weevil larvae do not have legs. And they're going to feed on the roots if we're talking about a root weevil. So you would have to dig around the base of the plant and dig into the soil, and maybe you'll see some injury. And sometimes they do cause significant injury. Here's a fairly significantly damaged strawberry plant, for instance, caused by root weevil damage. Probably in conditions regionally, the damage by the larvae is fairly inconspicuous and not overly damaging. We don't have really high populations. This can be a big problem in a nursery setting, but outdoors, probably not a big issue, but watch for. Now, the third issue that comes up with some of the root weevils is that they are one of the kinds of insects that wander into buildings. They're one of the nuisance invaders. The one that is probably the most important in terms of being a nuisance invader is the smallest of all the species we have of root weevils, the strawberry root weevil. And sometimes during hot, dry weather in summer in particular, these will sometimes flood buildings, and then people wonder what the heck it is. They're totally harmless in the building, can't do anything, they're not going to feed on anything, they're just kind of moving there, probably for higher humidity conditions, and once they get in there, it's the end of the line for them unless they get out. But there's still a bug in a building, so a nuisance invader. And then later in the summer, you might have the black vine weevil sometimes comes into houses, and sometimes the rough strawberry weevil comes into houses. And then we also have some new odd ones that are still unclear in terms of what the host plants they're feeding on are, that are quite small root weevils. The one on the lower right we think comes off junipers, but they'll also enter buildings during the summertime. So for root weevil control, were we to control them, you can target the adults or you can target the larvae. The adults are targeted with sprays on the foliage of some kind of persistent insecticide that will kill them, and the pyrethroids are the treatment of choice at this time. So various kinds of persisting pyrethroids, Tempo, Tallstar, Scimitar, Astro, and the like, will control adults. These have got various kinds of active ingredients. Again, the pyrethroids are insecticides that end in thrin. So cyfluthrin, bifenthrin, cyhalothrin. But for larval control, we use a different kind of approach. We would treat them with a soil drench, either of an insecticide or of a biological agent. The insecticide would be some kind of insecticide in the neonicotinoid class. It could be imidacloprid, it could be clothianidin, or we could use nematodes if you wish to have a biological approach for this. Nematodes in the genus Heterorhabditis. Remember, there are a couple of different genera of insect parasitic nematodes, but insect parasitic nematodes in the genus Heterorhabditis, those can be quite effective in infecting larvae of root weevils. Applied as a drench, and many sources will provide these organisms for you as an alternative if you don't wish to use a standard insecticide. Now, one last thing needs to be mentioned about root weevils is that there is another kind of insect that is quite common that produces notching along the leaf edges, but it's a different form, and that's the leafcutter bees. So the root weevils are going to produce a feeding cut along the leaf edges, but it's angular, irregular. Leafcutter bees, on the other hand, will make a cut along the leaf edge always, but is quite rounded, sometimes almost circular. And these are two different insects that make two different very different kinds of injury, and they do it for different purposes. A root weevil is actually consuming the leaf as it feeds. It's a feeding wound. Leafcutter bees, on the other hand, are cutting leaves to collect fragments of leaves that they then fashion into a cell, a leaf-lined cell that they then pack with pollen and nectar to provide for the food for their young. And leafcutter bees will usually be nesting in some sort of hollow cavity that they have previously excavated or found. Okay, let's move on to the last insect, a quite important species, the Japanese beetle. An introduced insect to this continent. It's been here for almost a century. Introduced originally into New Jersey, spread rapidly across the northeast quadrant of the United States, but kind of stalled around the Mississippi River until recently. And now it's started to move into our area in little pockets. It's a very distinctive insect, and it is an insect that is important in both the adult stage and in the larval stage. Now, Japanese beetle adults are going to be found associated with leaves and flowers. They feed on the leaves of many kinds of commonly grown plants, and unfortunately they also sometimes feed on the flowers of some important regularly grown plants as well. So the adult stage is a defoliator on above ground parts of plants, both leaves and flowers. When they're feeding on leaves, the kind of injury they do is a type of skeletonizing. So they're going to pick between the main veins, and this is the only kind of adult beetle or adult insect that produces skeletonizing injury. All the other skeletonizers we've talked about, like slug sawflies and leaf beetle larvae, it's the larval stage that does the skeletonizing. In this case, it's the adult beetle. The kinds of plants that the Japanese beetle will feed on are some of the more common plants that we like to grow. Unfortunately, Virginia creeper and grapes, roses, fruit trees, crabapple in particular, American linden, American elm, and in the garden it might be beans or a favorite plant as well. So here we see Japanese beetle damaging rose, feeding on the leaves on the right. It's also feeding on the blossoms, and the issues where they're feeding on the blossoms brings up particular difficulties in control, as we'll discuss a little bit more. But Japanese beetles love the blossoms of rose. Grape and Virginia creeper, again, a highly favored plant. Usually they are confining their feeding to the leaves, which they can lace up in a classic skeletonizing fashion. Usually this damage is done after flowering, but sometimes it is starting when flowers are still on the plants. And another plant that is very commonly damaged is American linden, a plant we have chosen to grow quite often around here, a very desirable plant for many features. However, it's a highly favored host of Japanese beetle. They'll feed on the leaves, and this starts early. Sometimes about the same time the plant is still flowering, and American linden happens to be one of the more attractive flowering plants that we grow as a tree that is used by pollinating insects. Now, the larva of a Japanese beetle is a type of white grub, and white grubs are the name given to insects in the family that Japanese beetles are in, of beetles, the scarab beetle family. We'll talk a lot more about them in turfgrass. They are fairly characteristic in their body shape. They usually have this C shape when at rest. They've got very distinctive legs, unlike a root weevil on the thorax. They've got very distinctive legs on the thorax and a head, and they're going to be feeding in the soil. In the case of the Japanese beetle, what they're feeding on are the roots of grasses. Other kinds of white grubs might be feeding on compost or decaying organic matter or something we don't care about in terms of plant care. But Japanese beetle is a grass root feeder, and it can do extensive damage to the root system of grasses. It's one of the most important insects in turfgrass, a subject we'll talk about in the last week of this class. Life cycle of Japanese beetles is typical of beetle. You're going to have eggs producing larvae. 3 stages of the larvae. When they're done, they're going to pupate and ultimately become an adult. All the stages other than the adult form are going to be occurring below ground in the soil. The sequence of these events is going to be that the adults are going to be mostly active in summer. The larvae are going to be in the ground for essentially the rest of the year. The adults will emerge often in late June, lay eggs. The eggs will hatch. You'll see most of the larval damage to the grasses being done in August, September. They'll also resume some feeding in the spring and then pupate. A 1-year life cycle. So every year is a brand new season. It starts with the adults moving into the soil, the females moving into the soil to lay eggs. They'll lay eggs in a small group. The soil has to be suitably moist for them to lay their eggs, because, as we'll get to, the eggs are very sensitive to drying, and then they'll emerge and then feed for a little bit and lay some more eggs and feed for a bit and then re-enter the soil and lay some more eggs. These eggs, as well as the first stage larvae, are very sensitive to soil drying, and an implication of this is that if we have conditions that favor these 2 stages, there'll be good survival. and then later we'll see large numbers of adults. So if we have a year where when they're laying eggs and the eggs are hatching and they're at the first instar larvae, the soil is evenly moist and not irregularly drying out, they'll do well. They'll survive well. We'll see lots of grubs damaging the lawns in that late summer, and then the next year, and then the following season we'll see lots of adults. Conversely, and this happens a lot around here, we have dry periods in the summer, and the soil does dry down, and that's not good for the Japanese beetle larvae or the first stage eggs, and so they'll die. And then subsequently we won't see as many adults the next year. So you can more or less anticipate how bad the adult populations will be based on what was the conditions in the soil, in the turf grass, in the general area the previous year, last July in particular, when the eggs were being laid and most of the young stages were present. Now, Japanese beetle happens to be an insect for which there is an outstandingly effective trap to capture it. It is usually some derivation of what is illustrated here. It's a vane trap. The vane is yellow. It is a funnel that then collects the insects into some sort of collecting container or bag underneath it. And the lure that it uses is a floral lure, a couple different floral components. They may also put a sex pheromone in, but it's mostly a natural floral lure that happens to be extremely attractive to this insect. And these traps are outstanding for being able to find out if Japanese beetle is present in your area. And this is an important thing to determine, because Japanese beetle is an insect that is continuing to expand its range, in particularly the western U.S. And it's also an insect that in the green industry has implications, because it is an insect that has quarantine restrictions applied or associated with it, meaning that areas where Japanese beetle are present, if you are trying to export certain kinds of horticultural commodities from those areas, you are subject to restrictions if you're trying to send them to an area where Japanese beetle does not yet exist. So Japanese beetle traps are used to determine what areas do have Japanese beetles, what areas don't. If they have them, then you under some sort of quarantine restrictions if you're trying to export to, say, New Mexico or Utah or California. Now, variations of this trap are widely available to consumers, and in areas where Japanese beetle is a common insect, you will see Japanese beetle traps very widely sold and purchased. And these are, again, some derivation of the yellow vane top with some sort of lure and some sort of collecting vessel, a little bag in this case. And these can be extremely effective at capturing Japanese beetles. You can capture bags full of Japanese beetles, and this is a very satisfying kind of practice. And as a result, Japanese beetle traps are very popular. People like to see a whole bag full of Japanese beetles. You get a sense you are doing something positive. However, a distinction has to be made on whether a Japanese beetle trap is useful for capturing Japanese beetles versus whether it's useful for controlling Japanese beetles, and the latter is not true. It is not an effective trap for control of Japanese beetle, at least damage. This has been shown for decades and has been a constant mantra from extension groups in the Midwest, where this insect has been around for so long. Japanese beetle traps do not reduce the number of insects in your yard. If you were to use a Japanese beetle trap in the near vicinity of some kind of plant you're trying to protect, say your roses, you would not only not get a reduction in Japanese beetles from putting that trap, you would get an increase in Japanese beetles in the vicinity of that trap. The reason for this is these traps, yes, capture large numbers of beetles, but they also draw in relatively more beetles than they capture. So the end effect is, in the vicinity of a trap, you will have more damage. The only effective use of these traps, perhaps, would be to provide it to your neighbors, but Don't put it near a plant that is susceptible to Japanese beetles, no matter how good it feels in terms of how many beetles you're catching in that trap. Now, unfortunately, Japanese beetle is an insect that is difficult to control and provides some problems for control, particularly when they're feeding on flowers. By feeding on flowers, we bring up an immediate conflict with trying to control an insect on a part of the plant that is also being visited by pollinators often. In the case of roses, it's usually bumblebees. On the other hand, there are some things we can do, and one of them, as maybe rudimentary as it may sound, is hand picking. There are very few insects that are so well managed or so amenable to hand picking than is Japanese beetle. They readily drop from the plant when disturbed. So if you have some sort of bucket or of soapy water and the like, and just put it under a leaf or a bud that has some Japanese beetles, they'll almost always drop off, maybe even as you approach, but certainly as you disturb the plant. So very easily collected. And this has a couple of advantages and values to it. One of them is that the damage that the beetles you collect is going to be eliminated once you collect them. But the other advantage is that Japanese beetles tend to recruit to plants that have other Japanese beetles. So if you've gone out early in the morning, gotten rid of the Japanese beetles on your plant, then other Japanese beetles flying around during that day are less likely to visit your planting and end up somewhere else. So, as arduous and as basic as it may sound, hand picking is something that should be considered for Japanese beetle, perhaps more than any other kind of insect you might find in a yard and garden. Now, there are some insecticide sprays that can be useful for control of Japanese beetle on ornamental plants. Neem products that contain azadirachtin, not neem oil, but the stuff that contains the active ingredient in neem, azadirachtin, that's a good repellent of Japanese beetles, can give you several days control. Most pyrethroids, cyfluthrin, permethrin, bifenthrin, they can work well as that acelepryn, the chlorantraniliprole, the new product that is coming out, presently only available for commercial applicators, a good product for Japanese beetles, and also one with low hazard to bees and other pollinators. Which brings up the issue. The big problem that we have with Japanese beetles is that if they are visiting flowers, labels prohibit you from treating plants with flowers in bloom that bees are visiting. You can't do that. It's illegal. We have a risk no matter what product we use. Perhaps more risk if we use a pyrethroid than the neem product or the acelepryn, but still a risk. So our options for controlling Japanese beetle are quite limited at present if we're talking about trying to treat them on a plant that has leaves and flowers, particularly flowers. Now, the larvae are also a target for insecticides and are commonly treated and are an insect that needs to be treated in many areas. The Japanese beetle larva is one of the most important turfgrass insects in the U.S., feeding on the roots of grasses, extensively damaging the roots of grasses, causing them to die or be stressed from the loss of roots. And there are myriad treatments we can talk about for control of white grubs, such as Japanese beetle. A biological control that's quite effective are, again, these heterorhabditis species of nematodes, the ones I mentioned earlier about root weevils. They're these insect parasitic nematodes that you can purchase, you can mix with water, you can drench into the soil, and those in the genus Heterorhabditis are good on white grubs and root weevils. There are also some new kinds of insecticides that work very well for all kinds of white grubs in lawns, imidacloprid, the chlorantraniliprole, which is now the Scott's Grub X, and now, most recently, a new product comes out that looks pretty good. It is a biological control type of Bacillus thuringiensis, a new strain, Galerii, under the trade name Grubgon, that seems to be worked pretty well as a Japanese beetle control as well. So we have options for larvae. Now, If we control Japanese beetle larvae in a lawn, that can be important if the larvae are damaging the lawn. But often people are considering treating lawns to prevent damage by the adults that are feeding on their roses or their linden trees and the like. Is treatment of Japanese beetle larvae going to help prevent damage in your yard by the adults? Unfortunately, probably not much. This is an insect that is so highly mobile that the beetles that you have in your yard probably originated from a block, several blocks away, not your own yard. But it can have the effect of protecting your grasses, your lawns from the effects of the larval stage of this, and may have some suppressive effect in terms of overall populations. Okay, we are done talking about insects that are chewing on leaves, the defoliators. I would now like you to think a little bit about the things we've seen over the last week and think about how damaging are these, because some of them are probably not all that damaging. Some of them may be just an aesthetic kind of injury, but some may show real impacts on the health of the plant. So a couple of things to think about is, how intense is the defoliation? Do you have lots of insects? Are they chewing a high percentage of the foliage? Are they doing it more than 1 year at a time? Is it back to back? But also some other things to consider. When are they feeding? Are they chewing the leaves or needles early in the year, or are they coming out late? How would that affect the impact of a defoliation episode? Some are feeding on conifers. Some are feeding on deciduous trees. How would that affect the impact of these defoliating insects? If it's on conifers, some are on the old growth before the new growth comes out. Some concentrate on the new growth, so it's gone that year. How does that affect the impact of this kind of defoliator? So there's a range, and some other things. Getting to the bottom of these bullets here, the health of the plant. Is it a plant that was in good shape to begin with, has high amount of energy reserves, and can take some nicking from a couple episodes of some leaf loss, or is it one that's been struggling? Also, is it susceptible to secondary pests? Some kinds of plants have other secondary pests associated with it. Aspen, for instance, tends to get cytospore canker. Some of the pines and conifers tend to have bark beetles that are associated with them if they get stressed. So, does your plant you're considering that has some defoliating insect have issues with that? Anyway, this will be a subject of discussion for this week's general topic. So that finishes up defoliation injuries. So we'll move on to something else next week.